I'm tired of this. If you say these turntables are not good quality, that they're lo-fi or at best mid-fi or whatever, they're not audiophile enough, I'm going to tell you to go jump in a lake.
Welcome to My Own Devices. This video contains much discussion about records, record players and wires. If you enjoy these kinds of things, you're in for a treat. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe.
Today's video is going to feature my two Technics SL-1200MK2 turntables. What I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the sound of the stock Technics turntable to one where I've upgraded the cables on. And I upgraded the cables in the tone arm wires and the phono cables that come out the bottom. A tremendous advantage of owning one of these turntables is that it's relatively easy to find spare parts, replacement parts, and upgrades. This is a former DJ turntable, and you can tell because it has some areas of wear around the top here, on top of the deck here, especially around the outside and the corners. I mean, it's still very solid, fully functional, still works just fine. It doesn't look bad from a distance, but when you look at it up close, you might see some of the wear and tear. But it works great. And one of the first things I noticed when I bought it is that the phono cables, the RCA cables, were damaged. So I bought some replacement ones, and I found a guy on eBay that makes these to order. You pick out the length, and he makes them. And they're only like $20 or something, $21 I think. And here's what you get. He sends them like this, and they've come loose here. And then he, on the other end bit, he actually strips them and tins the ends to make it much easier to solder in. As you can see, you have the. I'll show you what it looks like when it's soldered in, what they look like. But this is very helpful what he does here. So these here are the stock cables, and these are the upgraded cables, and these are gold plated, and I don't know what these are made out of. And these connectors are rather old and flimsy and cheap looking, right? But back in the early 80s, nobody cared that much, I don't think. The primary reason I changed the tone arm wires was because the little pins inside the bayonet style connector at the end of the arm were faulty, so the connector had to be replaced. I figured, why not just update the wires while we're at it? Regarding the tone arm wires, they are generally made of a very thin 32 gauge wire. They should conduct electricity very well and be extremely flexible and limp. I don't have a sample of what I bought handy, but I chose this set of KAB Superflex from kabusa.com. They sell a nice variety of parts, accessories, and upgrades for Technics SL-1200 turntables. I highly recommend them. The rest of the system consists of a Nakamichi receiver used in preamp mode. The signal from the preamp outputs go into an ADCOM amplifier, and the speakers are my old, reliable Ohm Walsh 2s. First up is the unit with the stock factory wiring. The cartridge is a vintage Shure M91 ED with a new elliptical stylus. I'm going to go with the old standby demo record, Steely Dan's Asia. I've been listening to this album on and off for over 40 years, and I've listened to it on many different systems. Another old standby demo record I use is Roxy Music Avalon. Traffic's The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys from 1971 is another great demo record that you should check out if you haven't already. This is my second Technics SL-1200 Mark II. Obviously they took the hinges off. I still have the lid, the cover, no hinges. That's a little job and expense to get those. Now this is the second SL-1200. Remember, this is the one which has the upgraded RCA and tone arm wires. So we're going to have a listen to this using the same records. I'm stunned by how much better this one sounds than the other one. And by simply, the only difference from what I could tell is that I changed the wiring and the cables in this one. But notes I had about the other one, I thought the bass was okay, but not super deep. I thought the upper mids were a little harsh, and I thought the treble was a little recessed and muted. That was my basic notes about the other one, that it just lacked some depth. It sounded a little harsh. And to me, I'm very sensitive to glare and upper mid-range harshness, or you know, it really irritates my ears. And I thought I didn't get the pleasure out of that turntable that I got out of this one. As soon as I plugged this in and started playing this record on it, I said, oh my God, it's much smoother highs. All the harshness that I heard before is gone. There's more shimmer and life in the music. And I thought the bass was deeper and firmer and a more three-dimensional soundstage. I'm going to give it a few more minutes of listening, but that's my initial impressions just playing the Steely Dan album. But let's give it a bit more of a listen to a couple other records. All right, these are my conclusions. Obviously, this is not a scientific test, and I wasn't able to do any blind A/B testing because I'm just doing this on my own. The upgraded one definitely was noticeably sounded better to me. I thought everything about the sound was improved. The low frequencies, the mid-range, the high frequencies, it opened up. It was far more three-dimensional. The sound stage was way bigger and dynamic and impressive and enjoyable. The other one was not quite as nice. It was okay, but there was no comparison between the two. You need to be fairly technically skilled to do this kind of job. In terms of soldering, there's plenty of YouTube videos of people working on this turntable. It's an extremely popular model that probably sold millions, and a lot of them are still around, and DJs and other kind of record enthusiasts still buy these and treasure them and value them. This definitely is an upgrade that I would recommend to anybody who has this turntable, or probably this might be a nice upgrade for a lot of turntables out there, especially older vintage ones that are at least 40 or more years old. So I'm thinking, what else could I do to check to see if, what difference phono cables on a turntable make? And so I happen to have this SL-1100A Technics that is from the early 70s, and one of the things that I really like about it is that it has RCA jacks on the back, and you can use your own phono cables, whichever ones you like. They're not permanently soldered in like the SL-1200 Mark II. And I wish they put that on the Mark II, but they didn't. I believe like the Mark III or later, they did the same thing with the RCA jacks on the back. So I did some research a while back, and I bought these Blue Jean Cable LC1s. Now the LC stands for low capacitance cables, and these were highly recommended to for turntables. I know they're made by Belden, and they're good quality. They're rugged. They're strong. And so I'm going to try these, and then I'm going to do some listening, and then I'm going to try some little cheap RCA cables that I found lying around and see if I can hear the difference. Now I'm going to try out these cheap RCA, thin cables that I found lying around. And the only mark of quality they might have is their kind of a gold color of the terminals on the end. Does that denote quality? I'm not sure. But they're very thin and they hardly weigh anything at all. They're very flimsy. All right, that was very interesting. The Blue Jean cables, the higher quality cables, it definitely sounded way better. There was bass. That's the first thing you notice. There's rich, deep bass. It was smooth. The high, there was very little glare when I turned up the volume in terms of the mid-range highs. There was a lot of shimmer and feel to the cymbals on the tracks. The snare drums were impactful. There was dynamic. The bass was deep and tight, and the sound stage was large and sounded very rich sounding tone to the record with the Blue Jean. Now, when I swapped them out with the cheap thin cables, now I wasn't expecting much, and when I first hooked them, started playing, I said, oh, that's not too bad. That's okay. Not the worst thing I've ever heard. It wasn't. But then after some listening, I started noticing that, wow, the bass is really thin. There's not a whole lot going on there. There's some bass, but there's not a whole lot. And one of the things I do sometimes to test the bass is I leave the room and go down like the hallway or something, and I listen out for the bass there because I think it gives the opportunity for the bass sound waves to stretch out a bit or whatever. And there wasn't a lot of bass down the hall. It was very, very thin, not a mid-rangey, but I didn't hear that. I know you know what I'm talking about, so I don't need to explain. The sound stage was way smaller. The high frequencies were okay, but they were getting a little shrill. There was a lot less depth to the sound. It was definitely extremely noticeable difference between these two cables. The more expensive, I'm saying these are not very expensive phono cables. These are, I said, $30 to $40 as I recall. Now I think I'm going to swap out this turntable and compare it to one of my SL-1200 Mark IIs, the one with the upgraded cables, and see if I can tell the difference. I know they're different turntables, but I'm just curious, as people are, I'm curious to see which one of these two models sounds better in my system. All right. After some listening, I determined that they're very similar in the upper frequencies and the mid-range. I didn't detect a huge difference in those all-important top to middle frequencies. However, I did notice that the other turntable, the SL-1200A, was producing deeper bass overall. Just a general, maybe another, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but octave or so of deeper bass. I could tell that in the room, I could tell that when I went down the hall. However, the bass coming from this turntable with the soldered in, upgraded cables was a bit tighter and more articulate. I made a note here that the bass is tight and articulate, not as deep as the other 1100A. They're very similar, and I could definitely follow the bass guitar more easily, I believe, with this turntable than I could with the other, although the other one was fine in that regard. So I think the other one is probably maybe a little better in terms of bass response, however you want to describe it. But this one was very good as well. It wasn't a huge difference. I definitely prefer this one. It's a bit more solid, it's a bit slicker, a bit easier to use, but that other one, it might sound a little better actually. So anyway, that's life of a audio enthusiast. You've got there's always compromises. There's always something, you get something and you lose something, especially on a modest budget. All right, I've had another day to think about this whole thing, and these are my final thoughts, I promise you. I've decided to conclude that it was the cables and wires that determined the difference in sound of the 3 turntables that I tested. It wasn't very scientific, I know. Now, could other factors have contributed to the differences? Absolutely. Now, the thing is, though, the signal path in a turntable is very straightforward. Probably the most direct of any hi-fi component. There are no capacitors, resistors, or transistors in the signal path, and I used the same cartridge in all 3 units, and the rest of the components were unchanged. Therefore, I must conclude that changing the wiring and cables in your turntable will noticeably affect how it sounds, for better or for worse. So there you go. And I thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video.